Hi, Shannon Rowe Jackson here from Caution Artists at Play, and today I want to talk a little bit about realism. And I am going to be showing you my progress on my recent candy piece, but I do want to mention that this is not a step-by-step tutorial on how to draw candy. This piece was one that I took on as a challenge for myself, and I definitely learned a lot with this one. And so for this video, instead of doing a tutorial, I want to talk a little bit about my thinking and my thought process in general when I was working through this very detailed piece. This is part of a candy series I've been working on for years in colored pencil, and this is my most detailed colored pencil piece yet, probably in all, but definitely the most detailed of the series so far. And so I want to just talk about realism in general, because I think the principles that I used while working on this can go across the board when you are working on anything realistic, especially if it's something this detailed. And honestly, when you're working on something detailed like this, in some ways it can be a little bit easier because it's easier to break things down in sections. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is using abstract shapes to create realism. All of realism is really just abstract shapes put together to look like something else. And when you think of it this way, it's a lot easier to break things down, and it makes things feel a little less overwhelming. So for a piece like this, I worked section by section, and I just looked at my negative shapes, I looked at my abstract shapes, and I drew those shapes rather than thinking about the fact that I was drawing candy. As human beings, our minds kind of work on iconography, and so if you are someone who is able to picture things in your mind, because I know there are some people who can't, but if you are somebody who is able to think of a word and you can picture it in your mind, quite often, like if you think of the word apple, you get a picture in your mind, and it's often the same kind of generic apple picture in your mind every time you say the word apple. It's not usually a very detailed piece, because really the brain does not need to remember every single detail of an apple in order to recall the apple in your mind. It really just needs to have a basic form or a basic icon to get its point across when you're trying to recall something. It's only going to keep the details necessary to get its point across. And so when you think of things that way, it's really important to have some sort of reference if you want to do realism. And when you have your reference, then you're able to break it down more. Because if you start looking away from your reference when you're trying to do photorealism, and in your mind you're like, I know what a piece of candy looks like, or I know what an apple looks like, chances are you're going to start drawing that generic apple that you normally picture in your mind. You're not going to be drawing the apple that's in your reference. And so it's important to look at your reference often, but also another way to get away from that icon in your mind is to break it down and not even think of it as what you're drawing, not even think of it as the piece of candy or the apple. Think of it as a group of abstract shapes. And that's what I'm doing here. I am going piece by piece, little by little, and I am looking at those abstract shapes. I am also looking at my values of those abstract shapes. Values, as you know, is very important. A lot of artists argue that it's more important than color. And of course, if you do use a color picker because you want to use specific colors, which I did use a color picker here, it actually is going to help you to see the value of that color as well. So if you're somebody who wants to get as close to possible, use a color picker, because that helps you to see, oh, this is actually a brown rather than a yellow, and that's going to make it darker than just regular yellow instead of thinking it. So using a color picker helps you see the value of something as well. But I digress. I'm looking at my values, and I'm looking at the values of the colors that I'm using. I am also looking at my warm and cool colors. So I have done a video in the past where I did a snake drawing, and I did it in graphite, and it was a long time ago. It's probably not one of my best videos, but I think it was like 10 tips to creating realism. So a lot of this information is probably already in that video, but I think it is worth repeating. So the main things that I think about when I'm working on a piece like this is obviously the abstract shapes, as I have mentioned, but also variety. Variety is very important. You want a variety in your values. You want a variety in your color temperature. And you want a variety obviously, in your shapes, because realism doesn't mean perfection. Realism is capturing the imperfections in a way that makes it look perfect. And obviously nothing is perfect, but it's all just an illusion. All art is an illusion anyway, but realism is especially an illusion. And so when you're looking at these abstract shapes, it's helping you break this down into ways of seeing those imperfections, but also overlooking those imperfections, because you're capturing what's actually there as opposed to what you think should be there. And that's not to say that I don't change things from my reference photos. I took this reference photo forever ago, and I actually, when I set up this reference photo, I set up my composition. I didn't just take a picture of a pile of candy. I moved the candy around in a way that I thought was compositionally pleasing. But then also, during the drawing process, you'll see later on, I end up drawing a green piece of candy. Actually, I don't think that's on video, but there was a piece of candy that was kind of broken in my original photo, and it was supposed to be another peppermint, but I changed it to a green one to balance it out. So this is not to say to not change your reference photo. I do that all the time. But to get the basics down and to get the shapes down, we're looking at the negative shapes, and we're looking at how they interact with the positive shapes and the little negative shapes within the negative shapes. That's how I'm able to get the detail behind the candy. And that's how I'm actually able to get the detail on the cellophane wrappers, because that was the biggest challenge here. Transparency and the shininess of the wrappers. And I really enjoyed that challenge, but it was something that I really had to keep in mind. I was looking at what was behind the cellophane in order to create that transparent look, and that was mainly abstract shapes. And there were a lot of times when I'm like looking at it, I'm like, this looks like nothing. But of course it looks like nothing because it's a bunch of abstract shapes put together. And then as soon as I backed away and looked at it, I'm like, oh wow, that really does look like a wrapper. So it's really like a puzzle. It's just it's a fun way to look at it, as like it's a puzzle. Each piece fits together the way it should, and then it all comes together in the end to create a beautiful image. And it's easier to draw those little small abstract shapes than to think of these big bold shapes. And it's not just colored pencil, like you can take this to other mediums as well. Something like this, especially like a still life or something, is a perfect example of a great way to explore these methods. And sometimes, like when I'm working in realism, I do not realism. When I work on landscapes, I kind of break it down a little bit differently, but at its core, in its fine details, I am looking at abstract shapes. Something else that I wanted to talk a little bit about is the pencils themselves. So you'll see here that I am using polychromos, a few Prismacolors, some very thins, and some Derwent Lightfast. Now, I chose these pencils mainly because they were easier for me to access. Because my studio is a mess right now. I'm renovating my studio, as many of you know, and I don't have great access to all my art supplies, and these drawers of pencils were easier to access than my other ones. And so that's the brands I ended up using. Really, any brand would work. But I laid down mostly the polychromos first because it gets into the tooth of the paper. So I did my light layers with polychromos because they're nice and fine. And then I came over with my Derwent Lightfast and my Prismacolors because those were easier to burnish. Now, Derwent Lightfast is technically an oil-based pencil like the polychromos. I mean, they're all oil and wax, but some have lean more towards oil, some lean more towards wax. Obviously, Prismacolor is the ultimate wax-based pencil. But it's waxier, the Lightfast is waxier than polychromos. And so they're easier to burnish, and that helped a lot to get this candy texture down. So that's another tip. You can use oil and wax-based together, but I find that I like to layer my wax-based ones on top of my oil-based ones when I'm working with them together. Of course, I could have done this whole thing with just oil-based, and it would have been fine. It would have just taken me longer to get to that burnishing stage, or I could have done the whole thing with wax-based, but I would have had to be careful to make sure my layers were extra light so it didn't burnish too soon. So as you can see, I'm just going around and looking at those details. This piece took a very, very long time. I actually started it at the end of January, and I just finished it on March 11th or March 12th. So it took a while. Now, I was only working on it on weekends because I work during the week. And I also was doing smaller projects in between. So every video you've seen since January before this one was in conjunction with me doing this. So I was working on this beside other projects that I was doing. So I did a lot of small projects in between. So that was part of it. But I knew that this one was going to be a commitment. And this took a lot of patience. Now, all in all, it probably was it was over 10 hours at least of work. I think it was probably at least 15, if not closer to 20. I did not film every piece of candy. There were times when it wasn't the best lighting, and there were times when it was just kind of in between things, and I knew this was not going to be a step-by-step tutorial, so I didn't film all of it because it just would have been an outrageous amount of footage. And I find it easier to concentrate on my drawing when I don't have to film as much. That's why I haven't been doing a whole lot of colored pencil artwork on my channel, because it does take a lot of concentration at times, but it becomes worth it. So for the highlights, I am using the brush and pencil touch-up texture titanium white mixture. It's like the magic mixture, and it is archival. It is made to go on colored pencil. I'll link everything in the description below. But it is a product that is made to go with colored pencil, and so it won't chip off, as opposed to something like Posca pens or gel pens or something like that. Those are water-based, so they do not go over wax very well, and it is not necessarily archival over time, but these products are archival to be used with colored pencil. And I am working on hot press watercolor paper. It's Arches Hot Press, and I find it takes a lot of layers with colored pencil. So let's talk a little bit more about realism. Let's talk about color. Now, I actually love color. Color is one of my favorite things, obviously. That's why you see me work in color more than black and white. I did not have to get every single color in this piece, nor would it even be possible, perfect, in order to get my point across. I looked at my values, and I grabbed whatever pencils I thought were closest. And there were times when my eyes were getting a little fuzzy looking at this reference because there is a lot to it. So I decided to use a color picker. I just did it in MS Paint. And as I mentioned previously, a color picker can be really helpful even when trying to find your values as well, especially if you're someone who's new to color. So I definitely recommend trying it out even if you're somebody who's experienced like me and you have a composition like this that has a lot of different colors. But the thing that I really wanted to talk about in reference to color is that there are often a lot of unexpected colors, and that will help add to your realism as well. There were some blues here in the shadows. There was a lot of browns and grays and things like that, and a lot of purples. A lot of colors that if you looked at this piece finished, you would have no idea that I added in there. And I found that to be really fun and exciting, like a fun scavenger hunt. And now I'm somebody who has been working with color for many years, and so for the most part, I'm pretty good at it, but with something like this, it can get tricky, and so I did use the color picker, and I did find it helped a lot, especially for the little shadow areas in between the candy. So that's another tip I have, is to check a color picker if you need to. Another way that you can do it is you can just punch a hole in a neutral colored piece of paper and put that hole over your reference, over the color you want to look at. It'll isolate that color, and you'll be able to see it more clearly. With this, it was just a lot of information that I was taking in all at once, and so it was easily jumbled in my mind. And so if you are feeling that way when you're looking at a color because you've already been looking at so many colors and you're like, I can't even see color anymore, definitely use a color picker. And I paid attention to my cool colors and my warm colors, even within certain colors. Like you'll see, like green, a lot of the green on that candy leans more towards cool colors, but towards the light, they got warmer. Or if there was an area that was closer to a yellow piece of candy, I was making sure I was using a warmer, more yellow-green because that color was reflecting off it. So anytime you're working from a reference, light is one of your most important tools. your most important tool when you're taking a photo, and it is your most important tool when you are trying to create realism, because light is what's going to give you your values. And obviously your color is going to change according to light as well. But in this particular piece, the highlights were not the most important part. They lent themselves to it, but the lighting itself all over the candy was also very important in creating depth. So don't just do a mid-tone and then plop a highlight on it. You know, look at your reflective light, because there's going to be light reflecting from the bottom of things. Look at your different shadow shapes. Look at the colors of your shadows, because the colors that are reflecting on these, even in the shadow areas, are going to take on the hue of something next to it. Everything relates to something else. So you have your abstract shapes, you have your values, and you have your relation to the things around it. The color that you're using is going to be influenced by whatever is near it. So keep that in mind when you're working on your own work. Something else that was very intriguing about this piece for me, I mentioned before, is the cellophane, because of the transparency. There were a lot of times when I could bring in gray, but again, talking about the colors that relate to it, the cellophane, even the parts that weren't attached to the candy itself, but the little twisty parts, those also took on a lot of the color, not just when you're seeing through it, but also in the highlights of it. And I kept that in mind as well. So I came over with my brush and pencil touch-up texture titanium white mixture. And then there were times when I would come back over with color, because even the lighter part kind of took a little bit of a tint from what was near it. And I tried to keep a sharp point for the most part, but there were times in the background where I didn't need to, because I knew that I would come over with many, many layers. But I still wanted to keep as much of a sharp point as possible, obviously, to get into the grooves of the paper. This was such a fun piece. This was a commitment on my part, and I knew it would be. Like I said, I took my time with it. I did it over many, many days, many, many weekends, and I feel very accomplished after this piece. Now I will be working on a lot of quick projects. And then I do plan on doing another candy piece that's not going to be this extensive. I also really liked the color scheme here, although I have to say I did miss my blue pencils. I absolutely missed my blue pencils after this. And blue is another unexpected color that I brought into this, because some of the candy, the shadows, had like a blue-gray on them because they're white. The candy is white, and so there was some blue because I took this in natural light and the sky was blue. That day I took it by my window, so some of the shadows actually took on a blue hint. It's very, very subtle, though. So again, I was looking at my cools and my warm colors. It is all about variety and abstract shapes. I know, I've said it a million times. Turn it into a drinking game. You should. No, because then you'd be hammered if you decided to take a drink every time I said abstract or variety. Sorry about the noises. My animals are moving around. Something else that I did that was really fun and interesting towards the end of this, because I was marathoning it on my last weekend that I worked on this, because I was so close to the finish line. I just wanted to get it done. But I actually, and I should have mentioned, I've been blending with Holbein melts this whole time. I didn't use any odorless mineral spirits on this one. It's all been Holbein melts. But I found that to be very helpful when I worked on this last piece of candy, on the cinnamon. And I actually had come through and I was doing my light layers, and then I shredded some of my red colored pencil into a palette, and I picked up the dry dust with a dry brush and put that into the candy, or onto the candy itself, to try and get into the grooves of the paper a little bit and save my arm a little. And then I came through with my melts and melted it down. But then I remembered that in a previous video where I had tested out some of the Holbein colored pencils and the melts, that I could use it like watercolor. So I took those shavings and I used the melts and I watered it down to make a watercolor-like consistency. And then I went over this red candy, and you'll see that in a little bit. And it was so very exciting, and I can't wait to use this technique more. It's not something that I've ever been able to do with odorless mineral spirits because it stains the paper, whereas the melts doesn't. But here you can see, and that really helped for an underlayer. And of course, I let it dry completely before coming on top because I didn't want to damage the paper, and it didn't take layers very well if it was still damp. But once it dried, I was able to get the layers I wanted to do the rest of the detail, and that definitely saved my drawing arm a little bit, because I think I used muscles while doing this piece that I hadn't used in years, and so my arm was getting kind of tired, and especially, like I said, this last weekend, I had a lot going on. I was really, really working my butt off to get it finished because I was just so excited about it. I definitely feel very accomplished. Again, this is probably one of my most detailed colored pencil pieces, at least in a very long time, and it was something that I really needed to get out of my system. So if you ever do decide to work on a piece that's heavily detailed like this, I hope that some of the stuff that I've talked about here helps. I know I've been kind of rambling, but the main key things to remember is your abstract shapes, your values, and doing it little by little. Just take it chunk by chunk like a puzzle so it doesn't get so overwhelming, because even with me doing that at times, I felt like it was going to be overwhelming. And so I found that sticking to those main principles really helped me out, and using the color picker helped me out as well. I went back and forth a lot on some of these. Even after I thought I was finished on a piece of candy, I would come back days later during my next drawing session and do more touch-ups. I definitely touched up as I saw it fit, and kept going back if I needed to. Especially once I got new pieces in, I would go back to old pieces of candy and just make sure that they all related to each other really well, and it was working compositionally. And there I am doing my final pass of highlights. That stuff was amazing. It was a lifesaver, as always, as was the melts. And here it is. I hope that you really liked this, and I hope that some of these tips helped you. Thank you so much for watching this journey with me. You have a great day. I'll see you next week. Bye.